I was watching a video by a DeMar, I believe, from Texas, and in this video he is going through a critique of preterism. Unfortunately, he doesn't make a distinction between full preterism and partial preterism, and it seems to me in listening to this 11-minute video that he really doesn't have much of a grasp of what preterism of any kind is all about. It's easy, as I've mentioned in past shows, to create a straw man and to burn it up. It's the easiest method of argumentation around. He first starts off with giving some Bible passages about false doctrine and so forth, which is certainly very legitimate, but here he's begging the question. You first have to prove a doctrine is false and heretical before you can maintain that these verses apply to that particular doctrine. And he does a very poor job of evaluating preterism of any kind. He starts off by appealing to, he poisons the well. He says, you know, if you go back through history, you'll see that preterism was started by a Roman Catholic Jesuit priest named Alcazar. In fact, he says, preterism was first advanced in 1604 by the Roman Catholic Jesuit Alcazar to destroy the Reformed Protestant teaching that the papacy was Mystery Babylon, the great whore of the historical Antichrist. And there is certainly truth in this. Alcazar comes along and says, wait a minute, you study the book of Revelation. This book of Revelation isn't dealing with the Antichrist as we see him today. It refers to something that was in the past. And the book of Revelation really deals with events in the first century. Remember, Roman Catholics were very, very good scholars, and Roman Catholics in and of themselves, just because they came out with a doctrine doesn't necessarily mean that doctrine is false. The Apostles' Creed, you go into any Catholic church and you will find that Roman Catholics say the Apostles' Creed. They all believe the Apostles' Creed. Now, there are lots of things in Roman Catholicism that are in fact wrong, but there are lots of things that Roman Catholics get right. And so one can be wrong in other doctrines and with Roman Catholicism and be absolutely correct on an interpretation, say, on the book of Revelation. So just claiming that a Roman Catholic developed this view in a more systematic way with his commentary on Revelation does not mean that that view is false. But here's the problem with DeMar's argument, that the same argument can be used against the futurist interpretation, because futurism, that sounds very much like dispensational premillennialism, was also developed by a Roman Catholic Jesuit priest named Francisco Ribera. Ribera lived from 1537 to 1591, and this is the description of Ribera's understanding of prophecy in Froome's 4-volume work, The Prophetic Faith of Our Fathers. This is in volume 2, page 489. Ribera assigned the first few chapters of the Apocalypse to ancient Rome in John's own time. The rest he restricted to the literal 3.5 years reign of an infidel Antichrist who would bitterly oppose and blaspheme the saints just before the Second Advent. He taught that Antichrist would be a single individual who would rebuild the temple in Jerusalem, abolish the Christian religion, deny Christ, be received by the Jews, pretend to be God, and conquer the world, all in this brief space of 3.5 literal years. Now that sounds almost identical to what dispensational premillennialists believe, like this DeMar. And so here you have Ribera on one side pushing the prophecies into the distant future, thereby not applying that these prophecies would not apply then to the Roman Catholic Church. And you have Alcazar pushing those prophecies in the back to the past, and therefore not applying to the Roman Catholic Church. And so the Roman Catholic Church played both ends against the middle in all of this. But again, just because a Roman Catholic came up either with the futurist interpretation or the preterist interpretation saying that these prophecies have already been fulfilled, does not, just because they're Roman Catholic, mean that their expositions of those points of Scripture are wrong. So you have to evaluate the positions based upon the Bible itself. But what Meyer did, he immediately put suspicion on the preterist position by saying, hey, this was developed by a Roman Catholic Jesuit. But he doesn't tell his viewers that the futurist position, very much like his own position, was also developed by a Roman Catholic Jesuit. And I could go a little further with this. In the 19th century, that nearly every cult that developed in the 19th century, and this is especially true of Jehovah's Witnesses, is a last days emphasis. And you can go through their literature today, pick up one of their Awake magazines, and you will see that if you stripped out anything related to dispensational to Jehovah's Witnesses, you would see it sounds very much like dispensational premillennialism. In fact, I wrote an article about this some time ago because the Watchtower magazine and Awake magazine were left in my house. In fact, I talked to these Jehovah's Witnesses that had come to my house, and it asked the question, are we living in the last days? This is the same title that I used for a series of talks I gave on Bible prophecy about 15 years ago. And everything in that magazine sounded just like the dispensational view. The appeals were made to 2 Timothy chapter 3, sections of Daniel, and of course the Olivet Discourse. And so if we can play the poison the well game all day long. The issue comes down to, what does the Bible actually say about these issues? Now let me move on to some of his, to Darrell Meyer's other arguments. And he writes, he says in his little talk, the preterism rises or falls on the teaching of all of the events of the book of Revelation were fulfilled by AD 70. Again, what Myers does not demonstrate, does not show, and apparently has no inkling of, preterism was around for a very, very long time, going all the way back to the early church fathers. And you will find it also in historical works of Eusebius, especially on Matthew chapter 24. Frank Gummerlock and I wrote a book on this called The Early Church and the End of the World. In fact, I'm going to quote here Thomas Ice. Tommy and I have debated lots of times. He's a critic of my position, but he states, there is early preterism in people like Eusebius. In fact, his work, The Proof of the Gospel, is full of preterism in relationship to the Olivet Discourse. And so Alcazar and his position on the preterist interpretation of the book of Revelation, where did he get that idea? It had been around for a very long time. Eusebius talked about it frequently in his book, The Proof of the Gospel. There are all kinds of passages in there related to the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70 and coming out of the Olivet Discourse. You will find it in the Didache, which I believe was written prior to the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70, First Clement, and other books. And again, Frank Gummerlock and I deal with this in the early church and the end of the world. If you don't have a copy of this book, you really ought to have it. It dispels a lot of myths. One of the other myths that it dispels is to show that the early church fathers, the majority of the early church fathers, were premillennial. And this is false as well. If there's any premillennialism in the early church, these premillennialists borrowed that from Jewish sources. They did not borrow it from the Bible. There's very little exposition of premillennialism based upon Revelation chapter 20. And their descriptions of the millennium cannot fit with what the Bible has to say. Frank Gummerlock also goes through a number of things from the medieval period describing preterist interpretations of the Olivet Discourse in the book of Revelation. These are works that he has translated. This is for the very first time that they have been translated into English from Latin. So Stephen Myers on the historical argument is just flat out wrong. He does not know his history related to all this. He's poisoning the well. He doesn't know even the history of his own dispensational view and how his futurist view is also associated with Roman Catholic Jesuit theology.